The wind that scoured the Wyoming Territory in 1886 had a personality. It was a dry, rasping thing, born in the high deserts and funneled between the jagged spine of Red Butte Ridge and the slow, alkali-tinged waters of Bitter Willow Creek. It carried the scent of things ancient and things immediate, the sharp, medicinal perfume of sun-baked pine resin, the iron tang of the ubiquitous red dust, and woven through it all, the comforting, greasy aroma of cook-fire smoke drifting from the chimneys of Juniper Bluff. The town itself was little more than a handful of weathered, clapboard buildings huddled against the vast, unforgiving landscape, a precarious foothold of civilization in a world that preferred emptiness, into this abrasive embrace. The afternoon stagecoach groaned to a halt, its leather suspensions sighing in relief. The horses, caked in a paste of sweat and red dust, dropped their heads and blew hard through their nostrils. When the door swung open, a figure emerged who seemed at once perfectly suited and entirely out of place. Her name was Tamsin Pike, and she carried her life in a single, well-traveled wooden valise, its corners rounded smooth by time, and its brass latches dulled to a soft gold. She stepped down onto the hard-packed earth with a practiced grace that belied the journey's bone-jarring reality, her worn traveling dress the color of a bruised plum. She stood for a moment, allowing her eyes to adjust to the fierce, late-day sun, her posture straight despite the fatigue that surely clung to her shoulders. On the inside of her left wrist, just peeking from the edge of her cuff, was a thin, silvery line, a scar as fine as a stray thread, a story she never told. Across the single dusty thoroughfare that served as Juniper Bluff's main street, a man stood in the deep shadow of the blacksmith's forge. He was leaning against a support beam, arms crossed, his stillness a stark contrast to the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil that echoed from within. This was Harlan Roan, proprietor of the Roan Hollow Ranch, a man whose solitude was as much a part of his reputation as the quality of his horses. His face was a map of sun and wind, with lines etched around eyes the color of a sky moments before a thunderstorm, a flat, impenetrable gray, that held the promise of immense power and profound sorrow. He wasn't watching the stagecoach, not directly, but his attention was a palpable thing, a weight in the shimmering air. He was a part of the landscape, as rooted and weathered as the juniper trees that gave the town its name. Tamsin could feel the town's pulse, a low thrum of anxiety beneath the surface of daily chores. It wasn't just the harshness of the land, it was something human, something that curdled the air. As she made her way towards the boarding house, the sign creaking a lonely rhythm above its door, she caught snippets of conversation. Hushed words exchanged between two men loading sacks of flour onto a wagon. The name Dameron was a constant refrain, spoken with a mixture of fear and resentment. Silas Dameron, the name carried weight, the kind of weight that crushes things. The rumor, passed like a contagion, was that he had just acquired the water rights from 7 more smallhold farmers, families who now faced the choice of buying back their own water at his ruinous price or being starved off their land. It was a quiet, legal kind of violence, but it was strangulation all the same. The boarding house was clean, if threadbare, and smelled of lye soap and boiled potatoes. Tamsin secured a room for the night, her voice low and clear. Afterwards, drawn by a need to understand the terrain of her new, temporary surroundings, she found herself standing before the public notice board outside the sheriff's office. It was a chaotic tapestry of the town's life, a reward offered for a lost brindle cow, a notice of a church social, a faded poster advertising a patent medicine that promised to cure everything from consumption to a sour disposition, and then, tacked near the center, a piece of fresh paper caught her eye. The message was stark, written in a bold, almost desperate hand. Tutor wanted, to instruct rancher's sister, reading, elocution, good pay offered, apply Roan Hollow. The signature at the bottom was a barely legible scrawl, a jagged slash of ink that resolved itself into 2 letters. Roan. Tamsin read the words again, a strange stillness settling over her. Her life was a series of temporary stops, of teaching the rudiments of letters and numbers to children in dusty, one-room schoolhouses before moving on. It was a transient existence, one she had chosen, or perhaps one that had been forced upon her. This was different. This was specific. This was here. As her gaze lifted from the notice, it traveled across the street, across the river of red dust stirred by a passing buckboard. It cut through the shimmering heat haze and landed, with an almost physical impact, on the shadowed figure still standing by the blacksmith's forge. Harlan Roan had turned his head. His gray eyes, no longer scanning the periphery, were fixed directly on her. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to contract to the space between them. The clang of the hammer ceased. The wind held its breath. The dust settled. It was a moment of profound, unnerving recognition, a silent acknowledgement of something. It was as if a rein had been pulled taut, arresting all motion, creating a tension that was sharp and immediate. His expression was unreadable, a mask of hard-won neutrality. Her own face remained composed, but a flicker of something, an old wariness, a new curiosity passed through her. Then a horse snorted. A child shouted down the street, and the moment shattered, leaving behind an invisible, vibrating hum. Harlan gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, not of greeting, but of confirmation, before turning his attention back to the forge, the boarding house proprietress, a woman named Martha Gable, whose hands were permanently chapped from work, noticed Tamsin's pensive expression as she served her a meager supper of stew and hard bread. "See, you're looking for work," she said, her voice a low, confidential murmur. "That notice for the Roan girl." Tamsin simply nodded, pushing a piece of potato around her plate. Martha leaned closer, wiping the table with a damp cloth, her movements an excuse for proximity. "A word of friendly advice, Miss. Harlan Roan's a good man, a quiet man, since his wife passed, but he's got troubles that aren't of his own making." She paused, her eyes darting towards the window as if the shadows themselves had ears. "This business with the water, with Silas Dameron, it's a hornet's nest. Dameron owns the bank, the freight office, and half the men in this town. You don't want to get tangled in it. Folks around here who speak up against him, well, they tend to go silent." The final words were barely a whisper, freighted with a grim finality. Tamsin met the woman's worried gaze, her own expression calm, almost placid. She had mastered the art of revealing nothing. She dabbed her lips with her napkin, a small, precise gesture of finality. "Thank you for the warning, Mrs. Gable, but there's no need for concern. I'm only staying for one night," she said, her voice even. "I'll be leaving in the morning." Later, in the quiet solitude of her small, Spartan room, the words felt like a lie, a flimsy shield against a gathering storm. The only light came from a single kerosene lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the wall. Tamsin knelt on the floor and unlatched her valise. The scent of lavender and old paper rose to meet her. She carefully lifted out her few changes of clothes, a well-thumbed copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, and a small tin of ink. Beneath a false bottom, wrapped in a protective layer of oilcloth, was her real cargo, her slender fingers, the scar on her wrist pale in the lamplight. Gently unwrapped the package. Inside lay a sheaf of papers, thin and fragile as a moth's wing. It was onion skin paper, the kind used by draftsmen and engineers. The top sheets were covered in a precise, spidery script of a cartographer, depicting the intricate network of underground aquifers and natural water veins that fed Bitter Willow Creek, the lifeblood of the entire valley. They were geological surveys, detailed and expertly rendered, showing the natural flow of water before any man-made intervention. Tucked beneath them was another letter, this one written in a different hand. The script was shaky. The letters formed with a desperate pressure that threatened to tear through the delicate paper. It was an anonymous confession, a detailed account from a man who claimed to have been forced to help install a secret, deep-set diversion valve upstream, a clever piece of engineering designed to bleed the creek's main flow into a private reservoir on Dameron's vast property. It was a map of a crime, a confession of a theft so grand it could parch an entire community. This was Tamsin's burden and her purpose. She wasn't just a teacher fleeing from town to town. She was a custodian of a truth that could get a person silenced for good. Miles away, at the edge of town, where the lights of Juniper Bluff were just a faint glimmer against the encroaching darkness, Harlan Roan sat in his own pool of lamplight. The Roan Hollow ranch house was large, built for a family that no longer existed. The silence in the empty rooms was a constant, aching presence. In his hand, he held a worn piece of paper, a copy of a letter he had entrusted to the post rider weeks ago, addressed to a trusted associate in Cheyenne. He read the words for the 100th time, the message starkly different from the notice he had posted in town. The situation is critical. Dameron is choking us out. Legal channels are a dead end. He owns the judge and the law. I need more than a hired gun. I need someone who can read the truth hidden in contracts and maps. The tutor notice is a cover. Send someone who knows how to fight with facts, not just fists. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. The notice in town was a casting of a net into a dark pool, a desperate hope that the right person might see it and understand the subtext. When he had seen the woman, the stranger with the steady eyes and the scarred valise studying his words on the board, something had shifted within him, a possibility, as faint and fragile as a desert wildflower. Harlan stood and walked to the window, looking out into the vast, star-dusted darkness. His reflection in the glass was a ghost, a tall, lonely silhouette against the warm light of the room. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached over and extinguished the lamp. The darkness rushed in, swallowing him whole, leaving only the profound emptiness of a house with far too many empty spaces, waiting for a battle that was certain to come. The dawn broke cold and sharp over the Red Butte Ridge, painting the sky in hues of oyster gray and bruised apricot. Tamsin Pike had been walking for nearly an hour, her valise in hand. She had left Juniper Bluff before the first cook fires were lit. Following the rough-hewn directions Mrs. Gable had given her, the town, with its low-hanging anxiety and the palpable weight of Silas Dameron's name, fell away behind her. The air here, in the open, was cleaner, colder, and carried the scent of sagebrush and damp earth. Roan Hollow was not so much a hollow as a wide, open basin of grassland, protected from the worst of the northern winds by a high, stony ridge, a line of venerable willow trees. Their new leaves, a pale, silvery green, followed the path of a creek that snaked through the property. It was not a wealthy ranch. There were no grand arches, no painted fences, but where the town felt neglected and fearful, Roan Hollow felt tended. The stable, though built of weathered, unpainted pine, was structurally sound. The corral fences were mended and tight, and the small ranch house, built of river stone and thick timbers, seemed to have grown from the land itself. It was a place of order, of quiet defiance against the chaos of the territory. Harlan Roan was waiting on the porch. He held 2 steaming mugs of coffee, one of which he offered to her as she approached. There were no formalities, no wasted words of greeting. "Miss Pike," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to match the landscape. He took her valise from her hand. His own was rough, the knuckles scarred, but the movement was surprisingly gentle. He registered the weight of the valise, a flicker of surprise in his storm-gray eyes. It was far heavier than a teacher's wardrobe ought to be. She accepted the mug, her gloved fingers wrapping around the warm tin. "Mr. Roan," he nodded toward the house. "My sister is inside." The interior of the house was as orderly as the exterior, but the silence within was heavy, magnified by the high ceilings and the sparse, utilitarian furniture. It was the crushing quiet of a space built for more people than it held. In the main room, near the warmth of the large stone hearth, a young woman sat at a sturdy oak table, a ledger and inkwell before her. "Ivy," Harlan said, and the young woman startled, her head snapping up. She was 17, with the same gray eyes as her brother, though hers held none of his hardened certainty. They were wide and quick, like a deer's. Her hair was a simple brown braid, and she was fine-boned, a fragility about her that seemed ill-suited to this harsh land. She stood quickly, her hands clasping in front of her, the sleeves of her homespun dress too short, revealing sharp, girlish wrists. Miss Pike, she said. The word was a struggle, a physical effort to push the sound past a blockage in her throat. She flushed crimson, her eyes dropping to the floor in humiliation. Welcome to our home. Tamsin looked not at Ivy's face, but at the table. The ledger was open. The script inside was beautiful, a graceful, flowing copperplate that spoke of hours of meticulous, patient practice. Here was a mind that was clear, precise, and artistic. The voice was a cage, but the mind was free. "Thank you, Miss Roan," Tamsin said, her own voice calm and even, betraying no reaction to the stammer. "That is some of the finest script I have seen west of Chicago. Did you teach yourself?" Ivy's head lifted, her eyes wide with surprise. She nodded, a small, jerky motion. I copied from a B-book." "She needs her voice," Harlan stated, cutting through the nascent rapport. He had not moved from the threshold, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his hat still clutched in his hands. "She has to speak, in public, about a legal matter." Tamsin turned to him. The pieces clicked into place. The rumor of Dameron, the ad for a tutor, the desperate need for elocution. This wasn't a job. It was a preparation for a battle, and this frightened girl was being groomed as their primary weapon. "I see," Tamsin said softly. She turned back to Ivy, unlatching her valise and pulling out not a reader or a grammar book, but her worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. "Well, speaking is just breathing with purpose. Let's start with that." For the next hour, Tamsin worked. She had Ivy stand, away from the table, away from the ledger that was her shield. "We're not going to talk, Ivy. We're going to breathe, feel the air come in. Right here." Tamsin placed a hand flat against her own diaphragm. "Not in your chest. Deep. Where the power is. Now. Let it out. Slowly, like a thread." She had the girl breathe to a count. Then she had her breathe and release the sound on a simple vowel. "Ah." "Good. Again. Let the air carry the sound. Don't push it." Through it all, Harlan stood at the doorway. He did not move, did not speak. He was a silent sentinel, his hands gripping the brim of his hat so tightly his knuckles were white. He was a man who solved problems with his hands, with fences, with horses, with the land. But this intricate, invisible barrier in his sister's throat, was a lock he could not pick. He was watching Tamsin not as a brother, but as a desperate general assessing a new, strange piece of artillery. He was measuring her patience, her method, her quiet authority. He saw how she never patronized Ivy, how she corrected her posture with a gentle touch to the shoulder, how her voice remained a low, steady anchor in the girl's sea of anxiety. Finally, Tamsin opened the book. Just one line. "Ivy, breathe first, then let the words ride on the air." Ivy looked at the page. Her eyes traced the letters. She took a deep, shuddering breath, just as Tamsin had shown her. Shall I compare the..." She stopped, the blockage winning, her face contorting in frustration. "You pushed," Tamsin said gently. "You're fighting yourself. Let the air do the work. Try again. Just the first 2 words." Ivy squeezed her eyes shut. She breathed. "Shall I?" It was quiet, airy, but it was clear. A tiny, perfect victory. A look of stunned surprise flickered across her face. Harlan's grip on his hat relaxed. Just a fraction. Tamsin heard the tiny scrape of his boot as he shifted his weight. He had seen it, too. "That's enough for now," Tamsin said. "Your muscles are tired. We'll try again after a rest. She stepped outside onto the porch, into the sharp, clean air. The tension of the lesson, of Harlan's intense scrutiny, had left a tightness in her own shoulders. She walked away from the house, following the sound of the willows, which led her to the irrigation ditch that fed the ranch's kitchen garden and the horse trough, and she stopped. The snowmelt on the high ridges was visible even from here, a white mantle that should have been sending roaring torrents down into the valley. The creek, though low, was still running, but this ditch, which clearly irrigated the most vital parts of the ranch, was little more than a muddy trickle. The water level was abnormally, dangerously weak. It was a quiet starvation. A light step sounded on the gravel behind her. It was Ivy, holding a glass of water. Tamsin took it with a nod of thanks. She looked at the muddy flow. Is the ditch always this low in the spring? Ivy. Ivy's brief moment of victory vanished. The fear flooded back into her eyes, immediate and choking. She visibly shrank. No, it used to be full, but before... Before what? Tamsin asked, her voice soft. Ivy wouldn't look at the ditch. She looked north, to the high ravine that cut through the ridge. But before Mr. Dameron's men started watching, from up there, she pointed with a trembling finger. Harlan says they guard the spring, day and night. There it was, the nexus of it all, the stolen water, the terrified witness, the brother who would hire a stranger under a false pretense. Tamsin suddenly felt the ground beneath her feet shift. This was not a simple range dispute. This was the exact same playbook she had seen before, the one that had cost her mentor his reputation and her home. This was a slow, methodical theft, engineered and enforced. She found Harlan by the corral, checking the hoof of a gray mare. He looked up as she approached, his eyes asking a question he would not voice. Tamsin stood a few feet away, her resolve hardening. This was not her fight. She had her own package of evidence, her own war to wage when the time was right. She could not, would not, be drawn into another one. She's a bright girl. Mr. Roan, Tamsin said, her voice clear and formal. She's just frightened. She needs time, more time than I have. She took a breath, the words tasting like ash. I'll be leaving in the morning. She said it as much to herself as to him. It was a promise, a defense. Harlan finished picking the stone from the mare's hoof and lowered the leg gently. He stroked the horse's flank, his back still mostly to her. The silence stretched out, filled only by the wind in the willows and the stamp of the mare's foot. He seemed to be considering the vast, empty prairie. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, almost rough. The stage doesn't run on Sundays. Tamsin's brow furrowed. What? He turned to face her, his expression unreadable, his gray eyes holding hers. Tomorrow is Sunday. There's no stage. It won't run again until Monday. He paused. You can stay one more day, if you're willing. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a simple statement of fact, laid at her feet like a challenge. They both knew it was more than a scheduling convenience. It was a negotiation. Evening fell. The house grew cold, drawing the three of them into the kitchen, the only room that held the day's warmth. A meager supper of salt pork and beans was eaten in near total silence. Ivy, exhausted from her efforts, retired early, leaving Tamsin and Harlan alone. The tension was a palpable thing, a fourth presence in the room. Harlan sat at the table, cleaning a rifle with meticulous, economical movements. Tamsin, unsettled, feeling the walls of her transient life closing in, knew she had to prepare for her departure. She retrieved her valise, placing it on the table to check her belongings. The kettle on the wood stove began to whistle, a low, rising shriek that cut through the quiet. Tamsin moved to take it off the heat, laying her oilcloth-wrapped bundle of papers on the table to free her hands. As she poured hot water into her mug, Harlan's movements stopped. The rhythmic shk-shk of the cleaning rod ceased. He was staring at the papers. Her hand had brushed them as she set them down, fanning them open just enough to reveal the corner of the top sheet. To a layman, it was just lines on thin paper. To Harlan Roan, a man who lived and died by the contours of the land, it was a language. He saw the precise ink lines, the numeric elevation markers, the geological cross-hatching. He saw the unmistakable, professional markings of a surveyor. The kettle, now silent, ticked as it cooled. The fire crackled in the stove. Harlan slowly placed the cleaning rod on the table. He did not look at her, but at the maps. His voice was dangerously quiet. "What did you do?" he asked. "Before you taught reading." Tamsin paused, her hand on the mug. The lie was pointless. The pretense of elocution had evaporated. He had seen her real credentials. This was the true interview. She slowly, deliberately, folded the maps back into their oilcloth wrapping, her fingers tracing the edges. She met his intense, stormy gaze. "I read maps that people were afraid to look at," she said, her voice low and steady. "And I drew them, Mr. Roan, which, as it turns out, is a much more dangerous profession." A thick, heavy silence descended on the kitchen, settling over them like a shroud. It was the silence of two explosives acknowledging each other in a small, confined space. It was the absolute, profound quiet that comes just before a thunderstorm breaks open the sky. The moon was a sliver of bone in an inky sky. It offered little in the way of illumination, forcing them to rely on starlight and a hard-won familiarity with the terrain. For Harlan, this was second nature. He moved through the darkness with the quiet, confident tread of a man walking through his own house. For Tamsin, it was an exercise in intense focus, her senses heightened to a painful degree. Every rustle of sagebrush in the cold night wind, every dislodged pebble that skittered away from their boots, sounded as loud as a gunshot in the profound silence. They followed the ghost of the irrigation ditch, its path a darker line in the pale, sleeping grassland. Harlan had said nothing after her declaration in the kitchen. He had simply banked the fire, checked the lock on the door, and retrieved a heavy coat and a rifle from a peg by the wall. He had handed her a lantern, unlit, and a thick wool blanket to serve as a shawl. The question of her leaving had been left hanging in the air, a statement of intent that the night's actions seemed determined to contradict. As they moved further from the ranch house, the land began to change. The gentle basin of Roan Hollow gave way to a rising slope of broken rock and stubborn juniper. The air grew colder as they gained elevation, and the sound of Bitter Willow Creek became clearer, a low, constant murmur to their right. They were tracing the ranch's lifeline back to its source, following the artery to find the wound. Harlan stopped abruptly, raising a hand. Tamsin froze behind him, her breath misting in the air. He knelt, his fingers brushing the damp earth at the edge of the main creek bed. He gestured for her to look. By the faint starlight, she could see them boot prints. They were deep and distinct in the soft mud, not the worn-heeled, familiar prints of a working rancher. These were made by newer, heavier boots with thick, defined soles. The prints of a man paid to stand and watch, not to work. They pointed upstream. They continued on. The sense of being watched now a palpable weight on Tamsin's shoulders. She found herself scanning the dark silhouettes of the rocks and ridges, searching for a shape that was too straight, too still, to be natural. The ravine narrowed, the rocky walls rising on either side of them, channeling the wind and amplifying the sound of the water. It was Tamsin who saw the anomaly first, her surveyor's eye catching a detail Harlan's practical gaze had missed. Ahead of them, a dense cluster of juniper bushes grew unnaturally thick, right down to the water's edge, thicker than the surrounding vegetation, as if deliberately placed or encouraged. A low, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the soles of her boots. She touched Harlan's arm, pointing. He nodded, his face a grim mask in the shadows. He unslung the rifle from his shoulder, holding it loosely at his side. They approached the bushes with infinite caution, moving from the cover of one boulder to the next. Harlan parted the tough, needle-sharp branches. The hum grew louder, a deep, hydraulic thrum, and there, nestled in a hollow dug out of the creek bank, was the source of the ranch's slow demise. It was a marvel of malevolent engineering, a diversion valve, cast from new, black steel, gleamed with a fresh coat of grease. It was at least 2 feet in diameter, controlled by a large, spoked wheel that looked strong enough to require 2 men to turn. Heavy bolts, their threads still sharp and clean, anchored it to a concrete foundation hidden in the bank. Leading away from it, disappearing into the rock wall of the ravine, was a wide-gauge iron pipe, its surface cold and sweating in the night air. It was an industrial parasite, latched onto the creek's heart, silently draining its lifeblood toward Dameron's private reservoir. Tamsin knelt, her analytical mind overriding her fear. This was a crime scene, and it had a story to tell. Harlan stood guard, his gaze sweeping the top of the ravine, his body a tense line of readiness. "It's new," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Less than a year old. I'd wager. See the lack of rust on the fittings?" He grunted in assent. "It's a screw-gate valve," she continued, her fingers hovering over the mechanism without touching it. "Highly efficient. They can calibrate the flow precisely. They haven't shut you off completely. They're just bleeding you, slowly enough that you might blame it on a dry season." It was the calculated cruelty of it that struck her most, the slow, methodical strangulation. Then Harlan stiffened. He pointed across the ravine, to a low hill, a quarter-mile distant. Tamsin followed his gaze. There, a tiny, flickering point of orange light, almost indistinguishable from a star, betrayed a campfire. The night watch, the man in the heavy boots. He was close, too close. A cold urgency seized Tamsin. This might be their only chance. "I need to take measurements," she whispered, already shrugging off the blanket and opening her valise. The tools she retrieved were small, precise, and beautiful: a folding brass surveyor's compass, a lead pencil, and her leather-bound notebook. Ignoring the distant fire, she set to work. She measured the angle of the diversion pipe relative to the creek's natural flow. She used the edge of the concrete base to estimate the gradient of the illicit pipeline. Her fingers, though numb with cold, were steady. Her pencil scratched quietly across the page, sketching the valve, noting its make and dimensions, recording the angles. She was translating the raw physical crime into the irrefutable language of science and mathematics. Underneath her drawing, she wrote a single, clear sentence, her own personal creed: "Technical proof always wins against rumor." She was so engrossed in her work, in the cold, hard certainty of the facts, that she didn't hear it at first. It was not a sound so much as a pressure wave, a violent crack that echoed off the ravine walls, followed an instant later by a vicious, tearing hiss that passed a mere inch above her head. The world exploded in a blur of motion. Harlan reacted with the speed of a predator. An iron arm wrapped around her waist, yanking her backward so hard the air left her lungs in a gasp. He threw them both sideways, behind the solid cover of a large red sandstone boulder. The impact with the hard ground knocked her notebook from her hand, sending it skittering across the gravel. For a moment, they lay there, tangled together in the darkness, Tamsin's heart hammering against her ribs, the smell of dust and Harlan's woolen coat filling her senses. The sharp, acrid scent of gunpowder drifted down from the ridge. "Stay down," he breathed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was already disentangling himself, pushing his rifle over the top of the boulder. The shot had not been a miss. It had been a statement, a warning. "They knew you were here. Now, get out." Tamsin peeked around the edge of the rock. Her notebook lay in the open, its white pages seeming to glow in the faint light. The evidence. "My book," she whispered, a knot of panic in her throat. Before she could move, Harlan raised his own rifle and fired. But he didn't aim at the ridge where the shot had come from. He pointed the barrel toward the empty night sky and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the confined space. a roar of defiance that was not a challenge, but a message. We are armed. We are leaving. We will not be hunted. Under the cover of the echoing blast, he lunged from behind the rock, snatched her notebook, and was back in less than 3 seconds. He pushed the book into her hands. "We're done here." "Not yet," she hissed, her mind racing. "The valve. We can't leave it. We can't fight them tonight," he countered, his voice firm. "That's a fool's game. I don't mean fight. I mean interfere." She pointed at the mechanism she had sketched. "There's a secondary locking pin on the axle for the wheel. It's a safety measure to keep the wheel from slipping under pressure. If you can pull it, the gate will loosen. It won't open the flow completely, but it will release some of the pressure. It will let more water through." He stared at her for a long moment, his gray eyes assessing her in the dark. Then he gave a sharp nod. "Cover me." He handed her the rifle. The cold, heavy weight of it was both terrifying and strangely steadying. She rested the barrel on the boulder, pointing it vaguely toward the ridge, her heart pounding. Harlan moved like a shadow, low and fast, back to the valve. He put his shoulder to the great wheel, but it wouldn't budge, locked tight. He pulled a heavy knife from his belt and began to work at the pin she had indicated, using the blade as a lever. It was thick, greased steel, set deep. For a tense 30 seconds, nothing happened. The only sound was his grunting effort and the scrape of steel on steel. Tamsin held her breath, her finger trembling near the trigger, her eyes straining to see any movement on the ridge above. Then, with a low metallic thunk, the pin came free. Harlan pocketed it and scrambled back to cover. A moment later, they heard a new sound, a low groan from the valve, and a distinct increase in the rush of water flowing past them down the main channel of Bitter Willow Creek. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Before they retreated, Tamsin did one last thing. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small sewing kit. From it, she took a length of bright blue silk ribbon. As Harlan watched, baffled, she darted out and quickly, deftly, tied the ribbon around a low-hanging juniper branch directly above the hidden valve. In the darkness, it was just a dark strip of fabric, but in the daylight, it would be a clear, unmistakable marker, a flag planted in enemy territory. They made their way back to the ranch in a fraction of the time it had taken them to go up. They didn't speak, conserving their energy, their minds racing with what they had found and the danger they had narrowly escaped. Back in the lamplit warmth of the kitchen, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a cold, heavy residue of fear and determination. Harlan cleaned his rifle again, his movements this time less about maintenance and more about a need for familiar, grounding work. Tamsin sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee, her gaze fixed on the papers spread before her. She picked up the anonymous letter, the one with the shaky handwriting. She read it again, but this time, new details stood out. The writer knew the exact specifications of the valve, the type of steel used, the pressure tolerances. This was not a simple laborer. This was someone with technical knowledge. And then, a phrase she had glossed over before jumped out at her, as per the fraudulent report filed with the territorial inspector. The territorial inspector. The writer knew the official channels, the bureaucratic layers of the crime. This was an inside man, someone crippled by fear but burdened by conscience. The fire in the hearth settled, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. The house was silent, save for the wind rattling a loose window pane. Tamsin carefully gathered her maps and the letter, wrapping them once more in their oilcloth protector. She placed them back in her valise and closed the lid with a soft click. She looked over at Harlan, who had stopped his work and was staring into the dancing flames, his face a hard landscape of shadows and light. Her own words felt hollow even as she formed them, a desperate incantation against the truth. "I'm still leaving in the morning," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Harlan did not turn. He did not look at her. He just continued to stare into the fire. his big hands resting, still and silent, on the rifle in his lap. He said nothing at all. Her words hung in the air, a statement of defiance against the very evidence of their shared danger. Harlan still hadn't moved. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was no longer the quiet of suspicion or calculation. It was the heavy, exhausted silence of two people who had stood on a precipice, looked into the abyss, and returned, fundamentally changed. Then, as if summoned by the tension, the weather broke. It did not begin with a gentle patter. It was a sudden, violent assault. A wall of water hurled against the small ranch house by a wind that moaned like a grieving giant. The first gust hit the tin roof with the sound of 1,000 pebbles thrown at once, a deafening, chaotic drumming that instantly erased the world outside. Rain lashed against the window panes in horizontal sheets, and a frigid draft snaked under the kitchen door, extinguishing the nearest kerosene lamp with a sudden foot and a wisp of smoke. The sudden plunge into deeper shadow, combined with the cacophony, made them both start. The only light now came from the warm, steady glow of the stove's firebox and a single lamp on the table, which Tamsin shielded with her hand. The roaring storm instantly transformed the kitchen. It was no longer just a room in an empty house. It was a small, besieged island of warmth and light in a howling, liquid darkness. Ivy, who had been sleeping fitfully in her small room, let out a small, frightened cry. Tamsin was halfway to the door before Harlan held up a hand. "I'll see to her," he said, his voice a low counterpoint to the storm. She's not fond of the thunder." Tamsin retreated to the stove, feeling strangely proprietary of the light and heat. She listened as Harlan's heavy, reassuring footsteps creaked down the hall, followed by the low murmur of his voice, a sound so quiet and gentle it seemed impossible it could come from the same man who had pulled her from the path of a bullet. The sound was comforting, a deep, steady anchor in the chaos. He returned a few minutes later, his expression softened by a paternal weariness. "She's asleep again. The storm. It brings back memories of the fever." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The night, it was clear, was not for sleeping. It was for waiting out the siege. Harlan, a man incapable of true idleness, seemed to cast about for a task. He retrieved a heavy leather saddle from a stand in the corner, one of its stirrup leathers clearly frayed. He brought it near the stove, sat on a low stool, and began the methodical, rhythmic work of mending. He pulled out a leatherworker's awl, waxed thread, and a set of needles, his large, calloused hands moving with an unexpected, practiced delicacy. Tamsin watched him for a moment. The storm made her own small room feel impossibly cold and distant. The fire was here, the light was here, and so, she decided, was she? "I saw a tin of cocoa in the pantry," she said, more to herself than to him. "Top shelf," he murmured, not looking up from his work. "Ivy likes it." Tamsin busied herself with the small, comforting ritual. She found the tin, along with another of sugar. She heated milk in a small saucepan. The gentle simmering, a domestic counter-noise to the violence outside. The rich, sweet smell of chocolate soon filled the air, mingling with the scent of Harlan's leather, the damp wool of her shawl, and the pin-sharp odor of the rain itself. She poured the steaming liquid into 2 of the heavy tin mugs. She placed one on the floor by his stool, within easy reach. She sat in the room's only other chair, a simple wooden rocker, and pulled it closer to the stove's ambient warmth, but the draft from the door was persistent, a knife edge of cold that cut through her dress and shawl. She shivered, drawing her feet up onto the chair, trying to make herself small. Harlan's needle stopped its steady pull and cinch. He looked at the floor by the door, where the rain was now beginning to seep in, a dark, spreading stain on the wooden planks. He looked at Tamsin, huddled in the chair. With a quiet grunt, he stood, walked to a large wooden chest by the wall, and pulled out a thick, heavy wool blanket. It was dark green, woven in a simple, honest pattern. He didn't hand it to her. He unfolded it. It was large, meant for a bed. He draped half of it over her shoulders, then sat back on his stool, pulling the other half over his own legs. It was a gesture of pure practicality. The blanket was large, and they were the only two people awake. To use separate, smaller blankets would be inefficient, and yet, the sudden shared covering created an immediate, almost shocking intimacy. They were now enclosed in a small tent of shared warmth. Tamsin could smell the faint, clean scent of lye soap and sun-dried wool from the blanket, and beneath it, the more personal, masculine scent of the man himself leather, and the faint, metallic tang of the cold night air still clinging to his clothes. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the roar of the storm and the steady, rhythmic snick, pull, cinch of Harlan's needle as he resumed his work. The kitchen was warm, the light soft. It was a pocket of impossible peace. Harlan finally broke the quiet, his voice low, aimed at the floor. The house wasn't always this quiet. Tamsin waited. She knew this was a confession, a pulling back of the curtain he kept so tightly drawn. "My wife, Sarah," he continued, his hands never ceasing their work. She filled it. She had a laugh you could hear clear out to the corral, even when she was sick. She had a fever, the doctor from Sagebrush. He couldn't get here in time. The creek was flooded. Just like this, he swallowed, and his needle paused for a single, heavy beat. After she passed, the house, it felt like it got bigger. The walls moved back, too many empty spaces, too much quiet. Ivy. She stopped speaking almost entirely for a year. That's when the stammer truly took hold, the quiet. It's a hard thing to live with. Tamsin sat very still, her hands wrapped around her warm mug of cocoa. She looked at his profile, silhouetted against the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the deep-set eye, the way his brow was furrowed in concentration, or perhaps in memory. She heard everything he wasn't saying. The guilt of a man who equated a flooded creek with failure, the profound, aching loneliness that he had papered over with hard work and a stoic demeanor. The quiet, for him, was an accusation. She, on the other hand, had spent the last 2 years seeking out quiet. She had lived in boarding houses and empty schoolrooms, and the silence had been her armor, her only friend. It was a space where no one could ask her questions, where no one could accuse her, where no one could find her. "Sometimes," she said, her voice so soft it was almost part of the storm, "the quiet is the only safe place to be." He looked up at her then, truly looked at her. His gray eyes, no longer guarded, were filled with a deep, weary understanding. He saw her, not as a teacher or a surveyor, but as a fellow survivor. He had filled his silence with work. She had filled hers with running. This shared, unguarded moment gave her a sudden, strange surge of courage. The lie she had told herself, "I'm still leaving in the morning," felt thin and cowardly. This man had shown her his deepest wound. She owed him her truth. She carefully set her mug down and leaned over to her valise, which still sat on the floor near her chair. She opened the latches, the click-click sounding unnaturally loud. She retrieved the oilcloth bundle and, placing it on her lap, unfolded it. She bypassed the maps. She bypassed the anonymous confession. She pulled out the final, most damning document. It was a letter, not to her, but from her, or rather, a draft. It was addressed to a federal judge in Cheyenne, a man her former mentor had trusted. It was her own statement, meticulously written, detailing how her employer, a powerful land baron in Colorado, had systematically forced her to falsify geological surveys, how he had used her doctored maps to seize the water rights from an entire valley, ruining dozens of families, and how, when she had finally refused, he had threatened her, framing her for the very fraud he had orchestrated. She had fled with her original maps and the one piece of evidence he didn't know she had, his letter instructing her to make the necessary revisions. She held the papers out to Harlan. He carefully wiped his hands on his trousers, set the saddle aside, and took them from her. The lamplight fell across the pages as he read. He read every word, his expression growing grimmer by the line. He read of her complicity, her fear, and her desperate attempt to make it right. When he was finished, he didn't hand the papers back immediately. He just held them. This is what Dameron is doing here," he said. It wasn't a question. "It's the same," Tamsin whispered, her throat tight. "It's the exact same plan. Steal the water. Forge the maps. Buy the law. I've been running from this for 2 years, and I ran. I ran right into the middle of it again." She looked at the floor, shame and fear a cold knot in her stomach. "If I file this," she said, her voice shaking, "if I add my testimony to yours, Dameron has friends, that man in Colorado. He has friends everywhere. They will hunt me, not just to silence me, but to the end." She finally looked up, expecting to see him calculating, expecting to see the rancher weighing the asset and the liability. Instead, his gaze was fixed on her, his expression one of profound, quiet gravity. He carefully folded her letter and placed it back on top of the maps. He didn't push the bundle toward her. He placed it carefully on the edge of her valise, which sat on the floor between them, and then, very slowly, he laid his large, rough hand on the worn wooden edge of the case. His fingers were inches from her own, but he did not touch her. He touched her burden. "You're not alone, Tamsin," he said, her name sounding solid and real in his low voice. Not anymore. The words settled in the small, warm space. They were a promise, a shield, an anchor. The storm outside roared, but in the small circle of lamplight, there was a profound stillness. Tamsin stared at his hand on her valise. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, but she made no move to wipe it away. The smell of the damp wool and the sweet cocoa, the sight of his scarred hand resting near hers, the steady, solid presence of him beside her, it all combined into a moment of pure, unadulterated safety. After a long minute, Harlan drew his hand back. He cleared his throat, as if embarrassed by his own sincerity, and took a half-step back with his stool. A small, subtle reestablishment of propriety. It was a gesture of respect, giving her space to absorb his words. Tamsin looked up, and for the first time, she gave him a true smile. It was not the placid mask of the teacher or the wary glance of the fugitive. It was a small, watery, grateful smile that reached her eyes. It was a silent, unadorned thank you for something she hadn't realized she had lost. She took a shaky breath, the resolve settling in her. The decision was no longer a calculation of risk. It was a simple, unavoidable fact. She started, her voice a little unsteady. "I think, perhaps, I'll be leaving, later than morning." Harlan picked up his mug of cocoa, which had gone lukewarm. He took a sip, his eyes meeting hers over the rim. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his own mouth. "However late you need, Miss Pike." At that exact moment, a brilliant, blinding fork of lightning split the sky outside the window. It bleached the room in a stark, instantaneous white light. For a fraction of a second, the stove's fire was invisible. The lamp was a pale yellow ghost, and on the rough brick wall of the hearth, the storm cast their two shadows, sharp and black. The lightning's angle threw the shadows closer than they truly were, merging them into a single, unified silhouette. Then the darkness crashed back in, followed a heartbeat later by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the very foundations of the house. But this time, neither of them flinched. The peace wrought by the storm was a fragile, temporary thing. Dawn arrived not with a fiery announcement, but with a quiet, pearlescent light that filtered through the retreating clouds. The air, scrubbed clean by the rain, was sharp and cold, carrying the rich scent of wet earth and sage. Water dripped a slow, rhythmic tattoo from the eaves of the house, the only sound in a world washed new. Tamsin stood on the porch, a mug of coffee warming her hands, watching the low-lying mist curl through the willow trees, For the first time in a long time, the thought of leaving felt less like an escape and more like a retreat. The tranquility was shattered not by a sound, but by a movement on the horizon, a dark line of riders, silhouetted against the pale morning sky. 4 of them. They were not moving with the easy, ambling gait of neighbors, but with a direct, purposeful pace that spoke of an unpleasant errand. Harlan emerged from the house, a rifle held loosely in one hand. He didn't need to ask. He had seen them too. He placed the rifle on the porch swing, a deliberate, non-threatening gesture, but a clear statement all the same. He stood beside Tamsin, his presence a solid wall of granite, his gaze fixed on the approaching horsemen. They rode directly into the ranch yard and dismounted, the jangle of their spurs and the creak of saddle leather sounding unnaturally loud in the clean morning air. The man in the lead was thick-necked and barrel-chested, with a florid face and a bully's confidence. He wore a dusty cattleman's hat and a Colt peacemaker strapped low on his hip. This was not a man who came for a civil conversation. "Roan!" he bellowed, his voice a coarse rasp that grated on the morning's calm. He strode toward the porch, his men fanning out behind him, their hands hovering near their own sidearms. "I'm Cade Hollis, Dameron's foreman. We've got a problem." Harlan didn't move. His hands were loose at his sides, his face an unreadable mask of hard neutrality. "You're on my land. Hollis, state your business." Hollis stomped up the 3 steps to the porch and slammed a gloved fist against one of the support posts. The entire roof shuddered. "Don't play dumb with me. The main reservoir feed is down by half. That's theft. We've tracked the pressure drop right back to your section of the creek. You've been illegally diverting Dameron's water." The accusation was so brazen, so perfectly inverted from the truth, that Tamsin felt a surge of cold fury. This was their tactic: accuse the victim of your own crime. "We have diverted nothing," Harlan said, his voice dangerously quiet. The lack of emotion in it was more menacing than any shout. His stance hadn't changed, but Tamsin could see the coiled tension in his shoulders, the readiness in his stillness. The worn leather of his own gun belt was visible just behind his hip, the handle of his revolver a dark, ominous shape. He wasn't reaching for it, but he wasn't hiding it, either. "I'm not here to argue," Hollis snarled. "We're here to search this property. Find the illegal tap you've rigged." He took a step toward the door. Harlan moved, not much, just a single, sideways step that completely blocked the entryway. It was an absolute, immovable statement. "You're not setting foot in my house. That's obstructing an investigation." Hollis jabbed a finger at Harlan's chest. It was then that Tamsin stepped forward, moving to stand slightly in front of Harlan, a shield of civility against Hollis's brute force. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried the unassailable authority of the law. "By what authority do you demand entry? Mr. Hollis, I assume you have a warrant signed by a territorial judge." Hollis was momentarily taken aback. He had clearly expected to deal only with the stoic rancher, not a woman who spoke like a lawyer. He sneered, a condescending smirk twisting his lips. "And who are you?" "Sweetheart, the new scullery maid." "I am a private citizen asking to see your legal authorization," Tamsin replied, her gaze unwavering. "If you do not have a warrant, then you are trespassing." Flustered and angry, Hollis fumbled inside his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He thrust it at her. "There, satisfied." Tamsin took the paper. It was a crude forgery. The paper was too new, the ink a shade too bright. The seal at the bottom, meant to be the official stamp of the county court, was a clumsy, waxy impression with none of the fine detail of the real thing. It was an insult to the law, meant to intimidate those who didn't know better. She looked up from the worthless document, her eyes cold. "This is not a legal warrant. The seal is fraudulent." Hollis's face purpled with rage. He was losing control of the situation, being made a fool of on a rancher's porch. "It's legal enough for this backwater. Now stand aside, both of you." At that moment, the front door opened. Ivy stood there, pale and trembling, her hands clasped so tightly Her knuckles were white. For a second, Tamsin's heart sank. She feared the girl's terror would only add fuel to Hollis's fire. But then Ivy did something extraordinary. She took a deep, deliberate breath, her small chest rising, a breath from the diaphragm, just as Tamsin had shown her. She held a single sheet of paper in her hand, notes Tamsin had quickly written for her the night before, a summary of the basic water laws they had discussed. Ivy lifted her chin, her eyes fixed on a point just over Hollis's shoulder. Her voice, when it came, was thin and shaky, but it did not break. According to Wyoming Territorial Statute, F-14, Section 3, she began, the words coming slowly, each one a small mountain she had to climb. All surface water, originating from natural springs and flowing through public lands, is designated for communal use by all registered landowners whose property it touches. Hollis stared at her, dumbfounded. The legalistic language, coming from the mouth of this trembling girl, was so unexpected it seemed to rob him of speech. Ivy took another breath, gaining a fragile momentum. Any private diversion requires a public hearing and a federally approved survey. Your document is invalid, sir, and your presence here is an act of criminal intimidation. The final words were spoken with a flicker of defiance, a spark of the roan's stubbornness igniting in her eyes. A profound, fierce pride surged through Tamsin. Harlan's face remained a mask, but she saw the corner of his eye twitch, a minute sign of his own astonishment and admiration. The standoff was broken. Ivy, with her halting, terrified courage, had won, but she had also enraged a cornered animal. Hollis's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. He spun around, his pretense of legality gone. "To hell with this," he roared to his men. "No more games, poison the ditch." Two of his men, who had been waiting with their horses, unstrapped heavy, sealed buckets from their saddles. Tamsin's blood ran cold. She knew what was in them. Hollis pointed at the main irrigation ditch that flowed not 20 yards from the house. "Dump it. If he can't have Dameron's water, he can't have any water at all." In a flash, Harlan was no longer a stoic guardian. He was a force of nature. He vaulted over the porch railing, landing lightly on the ground, and let out a sharp, piercing whistle. His black stallion, Storm, who had been standing in the corral, responded instantly, galloping toward him, as the first of Hollis's men pried the lid from a bucket, releasing a thick, acrid, industrial stench. Harlan was already in the saddle. The man upended the bucket, and a thick, viscous black substance, crude pitch, poured into the clear water of the ditch. It spread instantly, a hideous, iridescent disease, clinging to the banks and suffocating the life beneath it. Harlan didn't ride at the men. He rode at the fence. With a roar of effort, he spurred Storm forward, grabbing hold of a section of the corral fence. The horse dug in its powerful haunches, and with a scream of protesting wood, a 10-foot section of posts and rails was ripped from the earth. Dragging the makeshift barricade behind him, he galloped to the ditch, upstream of the spreading poison. With another powerful surge from the horse, he swung the fence section sideways, ramming it into the ditch, creating a crude but effective dam that instantly slowed the main flow of water. At the same time, Tamsin's mind was racing. Pitch, an oil-based contaminant, how to neutralize it. Her mind flew back to a dozen different textbooks, to the chemical principles of saponification, lye, or lime. The ranch would have lime, for the outhouse, for tanning hides. "The lye house," she shouted to no one in particular, and ran. She found it behind the stables, a small sack of white lime powder sitting just inside the door. It was heavy, at least 50 pounds, but adrenaline gave her strength. She hoisted it over her shoulder and ran back to the ditch, just as the second man was emptying his own bucket of pitch below Harlan's barricade. "Harlan," she screamed, "break the dam!" He understood instantly. He spurred Storm forward, pulling the fence section free. A wave of clean, dammed-up water surged downstream, just as the wave hit the spreading black slick. Tamsin, with a desperate heave, threw the entire sack of lime powder into the middle of the contamination. The paper sack burst on impact, releasing a cloud of white dust that settled over the black ooze. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The lime reacted with the pitch, the slick, which had been spreading and coating everything, began to seize and congeal. The liquid tar thickened, clumping together into floating, rubbery black masses that the current could now push downstream. Instead of allowing it to soak into the precious earth of the ditch banks, it was a temporary fix, a desperate piece of applied chemistry. But it had worked. They had saved the water, for now. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air, a long, mournful note from a hunting horn, echoing from the low ridge to the south. Hollis and his men froze, looking toward the sound. A moment later, 2 riders appeared, galloping hard. It was Old Man Whitlock and his son, followed seconds later by the Moreno brothers. They weren't carrying rifles. They were carrying the tools of their trade: pitchforks, shovels, and heavy scythes. They rode with the grim, determined faces of men defending their homes. The balance of power had shifted. It was no longer 4 armed men against a single family. It was now a community. Cade Hollis was a bully, not a general. He looked at the grim-faced farmers, at the mess of congealed pitch in the ditch, at the immovable figure of Harlan Roan on his black horse. He knew he had lost. "This isn't over. Roan," he spat, his voice filled with venom as he climbed back on his horse. He pointed a finger, first at Harlan, then at Tamsin, and finally at Ivy, who was still standing, white-faced, in the doorway. "You think you're clever. You think you've won. But you've just signed your own death warrant." He wheeled his horse around, his men scrambling to follow. As he galloped away, he threw one last threat over his shoulder. "This afternoon, that valve gets shut for good. This whole valley is going to go bone dry." The neighbors rode up, their faces a mixture of anger and concern. There were quiet questions, grim nods. Harlan dismounted, his movements stiff. He walked into the house without a word. Tamsin followed him. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving her trembling. She found him standing by the kitchen table, his back to her, both hands braced flat against the wood. She saw that his hands, the hands that could mend leather with such delicacy and tear a fence from the earth with such strength, were shaking. It was a fine, almost imperceptible tremor. The sign of a massive, violent rage that he had managed, somehow, to keep caged. She walked up behind him. She did not speak. She simply reached out and placed her hand gently over his. His hand was cold as ice, but it was steady under her touch. The trembling slowly subsided. He did not pull away. They stood like that for a long time. The only sound the ticking of the mantel clock and the drip of water outside. The battle was over. The war was about to begin. Tamsin's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, but it was filled with the hard, unbreakable certainty of their next move. "We're taking the evidence to the county court," she said, "before sunset." The high noon sun, a welcome stranger after the morning's violence, worked to banish the last of the rain clouds. Puddles in the ranch yard steamed, and the wet wood of the corral fences gleamed as if freshly varnished. The world felt quiet, holding its breath. Cade Hollis's threat, "This afternoon, that valve gets shut for good," was a ticking clock, and the long ride to the county seat at Sagebrush Ferry loomed before them. The hours between the confrontation and their planned departure were a strange mixture of frantic preparation and profound, unspoken tenderness. Ivy, imbued with a fragile but fierce new confidence, moved about the house with purpose, packing a satchel with dried beef, hardtack, and 2 canteens of fresh, clean water. She no longer seemed to flit through the rooms like a startled ghost. Her steps had a new weight, a new determination. She was a soldier now, packing for the front line. Harlan worked outside, his movements economical and precise. He checked the shoes on Storm and on the steady bay mare Tamsin would ride. He oiled the leather of their saddles, checked every buckle and strap, and cleaned their rifles with a grim, methodical focus. He was preparing for a journey, but it was the kind of preparation a man makes before riding into a battle from which he may not return. Tamsin, meanwhile, had claimed the porch swing. The evidence, her maps, the anonymous confession, her own damning letter, and the crudely forged warrant was carefully wrapped in oilcloth and stowed at the very bottom of her valise. In her hands, she held Harlan's heavy woolen coat. During the morning's scuffle, when he had vaulted the railing, a nail had caught the shoulder, tearing a 3-inch gash in the thick fabric. It was a small piece of damage, a minor casualty of the day, but to Tamsin, it felt like a wound she was compelled to heal. With her small sewing kit open on the swing beside her, she set to work. The needle felt familiar and steadying in her fingers. The world contracted to this small, quiet task, the push of the needle through the resisting wool, the pull of the thick thread, the slow, steady closing of the tear. It was a simple, domestic act, an act of care and restoration that felt like a quiet protest against the morning's ugliness. Harlan finished his work and came to stand at the edge of the porch. Watching her, he had shed his gun belt, and in his plain work shirt, he looked less like a warrior and more like the farmer he was. He leaned against a post, rolling a cigarette with a slow, deliberate motion that failed to hide the lingering tension in his hands. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice a low rumble. Tamsin didn't look up. Her needle continued its steady, rhythmic work. "I know. A rip in a coat is the least of our worries." "That's not what I meant," he said. He lit his cigarette, the flare of the match briefly illuminating the weary lines around his eyes. He took a long drag, letting the smoke out in a slow, thoughtful plume. "You could have been gone yesterday. You could be halfway to Cheyenne by now. Safe." Her needle paused for a single heartbeat. "Safe has become a complicated word for me. Mr. Roan." "Harlan," he corrected her, so quietly she almost didn't hear it over the drip of water from the eaves. She looked up at him then. The sun, breaking fully from the clouds, cast the side of his face in a warm, golden light. It softened the hard angles of his jaw, but it couldn't hide the profound loneliness in his gaze. "Harlan," she repeated, testing the name. It felt solid, real. He took another drag from his cigarette, his eyes on the distant, hazy line of the Red Butte Ridge. The silence stretched, comfortable and freighted with unspoken meaning. Tamsin finished her last stitch, bit the thread, and smoothed the mended fabric with her palm. The repair was neat and strong, a dark, straight line against the faded wool. She folded the coat and set it aside. Harlan finally pushed himself off the post and walked over to her. He stood before the swing, the dying cigarette held loosely between his fingers. He looked down at her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and a deep, aching conflict. "If you still want to go," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "After we file this with the judge, if you still want to leave in the morning, I'll ride with you. I'll see you clear of the territory." It was the most selfless thing he could have offered. He was giving her back the escape she had sought. He was acknowledging her freedom, respecting the transient life she had led. Even though every line of his body, every shadow in his eyes, screamed that he wanted her to stay, he was offering to help her leave, even if it broke him. Tamsin looked from his earnest, troubled face to the vast, open country that stretched beyond the ranch. For years, that horizon had represented a promise, the promise of a new town, a new name, a place where her past couldn't find her. She had measured her life in departures, in the quiet satisfaction of a packed valise and a road stretching out before her. Now, looking at that same horizon, she felt nothing but a hollow ache, the idea of riding toward it, of leaving this small pocket of warmth and danger and burgeoning hope, felt not like an escape, but like a self-inflicted exile. She raised her eyes to meet his. Her own gaze was clear, the confusion that had clouded it for so long finally gone. "I used to say that to myself every time I settled in a new place," she said, her voice soft but steady. I'll leave in the morning. It was a promise that I wouldn't let myself get attached, that I wouldn't let any place or any person hold me. She took a small, shaky breath. I said that when I still believed that there was no place that could hold me, I don't believe that anymore. The confession hung in the air between them, as real and tangible as the scent of the rain-soaked earth. It was a surrender. It was a declaration. It was the truth, stripped of all its armor. Harlan's face seemed to lose all its hardness. The weary lines, the stoic mask, it all melted away, leaving only a raw, unguarded vulnerability. He took a half-step closer, his hand coming up, not to touch her, but as if to assure himself she was real. The space between them crackled with 2 years of her loneliness and a lifetime of his, and then, very slowly, so slowly that she could have stopped him at any point, so slowly that it was an invitation and not a demand. He reached down and gently took her hand, urging her to her feet. She rose from the swing, and he drew her toward him. He did not pull her into a rough embrace. He simply closed the small space that separated them, his other hand rising to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. He looked into her eyes, a question in his own. She gave him his answer not with words, but with the slight, trusting lean of her body into his. The first kiss was not a clash of passion or a desperate claiming. It was a discovery. It was gentle, hesitant at first, a soft meeting of lips that had forgotten the language of intimacy. It was a question asked and answered in the same breath. And then, as his hand tightened its grip on hers, and his other hand slid from her jaw to the back of her neck, the kiss deepened. It became something more. It was gentle, yet utterly decisive. It tasted of coffee and tobacco and the clean, sharp air of the high plains. It was a quiet, solemn promise made in the eye of a storm, a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer two separate people fighting parallel battles, but one. When they finally broke apart, it was only by inches. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. She could feel his breath on her lips, warm and steady. A low, quiet laugh, a sound of pure, unadorned relief, escaped him. She felt an answering smile spread across her own face, and she raised her hands to rest on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. It felt like coming home. The afternoon sun slanted low, casting long shadows across the porch. Inside the house, the light grew dim. A lone oil lamp was lit on the kitchen table, its flame a small, golden beacon in the gathering dusk. 2 hands, one slender and pale, the other broad and calloused, lay clasped together on the worn wood of the tabletop. Outside, the wind, having scrubbed the sky clean, began to whisper a new song through the leaves of the willow trees, a sound not of mourning, but of secrets and promises. The window was half closed, the world outside held at bay. The universe contained for a few precious hours within the 4 walls of the small, warm room. The narrative of their journey did not stop for love. Love was not a detour. It was the fuel. It was the reason the journey had become not just necessary, but essential. It clarified the stakes, turning a fight for water into a fight for a future. Later, as they stood by the horses, the last of the preparations made, the moon rising over the ridge, Tamsin looked up at him. The night was cold, but she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with her heavy coat. She reached out and smoothed the mended seam on his shoulder, her touch lingering. "Not in the morning," she whispered, her voice a quiet vow in the darkness. "I'm not leaving, not until this is done." Harlan caught her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. His gray eyes, luminous in the moonlight, held hers. "Not until we're done," he said. And in that one, small correction, an entire future was forged. The moon was their only guide as they left the sleeping ranch. Ivy stood in the doorway, a small, brave silhouette, holding a lantern aloft. She did not weep. She merely nodded, a soldier seeing her champions off to a battle she could not follow. Harlan, with the glass jar containing the foul, congealed sample of pitch secured in his saddlebag, led the way. Tamsin rode beside him, her mare steady and sure-footed, the valise containing the future of the valley strapped tightly behind her saddle. The weight of it felt immense, a physical burden of truth. They rode north, climbing out of the basin and onto the exposed spine of Red Butte Ridge. The world opened up into a vast, terrifying expanse of silvered rock and black shadow. The wind up here was a living thing, a cold, searching entity that plucked at their coats and stung their faces. Every league they covered was a league deeper into territory that Silas Dameron considered his own. They were two small, moving specks in an ocean of hostile land. They rode hard for the first 2 hours, pushing the horses, eating up the miles while the darkness provided cover. But as the first, bruised purple light of dawn stained the eastern horizon, Harlan reined in, his head cocked. Tamsin listened, her heart hammering. At first, she heard nothing but the ever-present wind. Then, she caught it a faint, rhythmic drumming, carried on the air from miles behind them. It was the unmistakable, frantic sound of horses being pushed to a gallop. Harlan didn't need to speak. He just pointed to the southeast. A plume of dust, thick as chimney smoke, was rising against the new light. It was too much dust for one rider, or even two. "Hollis," Harlan said, his voice a flat, hard statement. "He's brought friends, and he's not waiting for the afternoon." They urged their horses into a run, no longer conserving the animal's strength. The pursuit was on. The terrain of the ridge was a nightmare, a treacherous landscape of shattered rock and steep, unpredictable drops. They navigated it at a speed that bordered on reckless. Storm's powerful black body leaping over crevices, Tamsin's bay mare following with a desperate, scrambling energy. The sun rose, and with it, the wind. It was no longer the searching whisper of the night. It was a scouring, punishing gale that howled up from the flatlands, carrying with it a weapon all its own. The red dust they had kicked up was now joined by 1,000,000 tons more, lifted from the desert floor. The sky darkened, not with clouds, but with grit. Within minutes, they were engulfed in a full-blown sandstorm. The world vanished, reduced to a roaring, suffocating vortex of reddish-brown. The sun was a pale, sickly disk. Tamsin pulled her scarf up over her nose and mouth, the fine, sharp particles stinging her eyes and coating her throat. She could barely see Harlan, a ghostly shape only a few feet ahead of her. The horses whinnied in terror, threatening to bolt. Tamsin's mare tossed her head, snorting as the sand clogged her nostrils. Tamsin reacted on pure, technical instinct. She unstrapped her canteen, pulled her own scarf from her neck, and soaked it with precious water. She rode up alongside the mare's head, fighting the animal's panic, and gently, firmly, tied the damp cloth over its muzzle. It was a crude filter, but it worked. The mare's breathing immediately became less frantic. Harlan, seeing her action, did the same for Storm. "I can't see the trail," Tamsin shouted over the roar. Her voice ripped from her lips. Harlan pointed not ahead, but to the side, at a bizarre, chimney-like rock formation that was momentarily visible through the swirling dust. "Coyote Canyon is 2 miles north of that. I can't find it in this." Tamsin's mind, the surveyor's mind, clicked into place. The maps, her sketches. She had studied them, memorized them. "It's not just that one," she yelled back, pulling her horse closer to his. "There's a line of them like teeth. Your map showed 3. If we ride perpendicular to the wind, we should cross their line." It was a desperate gamble, navigating by feel and by a map she had seen only once. Harlan nodded, his trust in her absolute. He took his bearings, set his shoulders against the gale, and they rode on. 2 blind pilgrims following a map drawn in memory, guided by the stone markers Tamsin had sketched. For an hour, they rode through the howling chaos. Then, as if a curtain had been ripped aside, They rode out of the worst of the storm. The wind still howled, but the air cleared enough to see, and what they saw made Tamsin's heart stop. Hollis and his 2 men were ahead of them. They had ridden hard on a wider, faster trail and, knowing the land, had cut them off. They were waiting. 3 dark figures at the mouth of a narrow slot canyon, the only clear path down from the ridge. Coyote Canyon. Hollis saw them and raised his rifle, a glint of triumph. They were trapped. Harlan didn't hesitate. He wheeled Storm to the left, away from the canyon mouth, and galloped straight toward the sheer rock wall that formed its eastern side. "What are you doing?" Tamsin cried, following him, her trust warring with her terror. "Changing the landscape," he yelled back. He led her up a steep, narrow goat trail she hadn't even seen, a switchback path that climbed the side of the canyon wall. Hollis and his men, seeing their prey escaping, spurred their own horses in pursuit. Charging up the trail behind them, the trail was barely a foot wide, with a sheer drop to the canyon floor. Tamsin's mare stumbled, and Tamsin cried out, her legs scraping hard against the rock. Harlan was already at the top, a narrow ledge 50 feet above the canyon trail. He leaped from Storm's back. "Keep going," he commanded Tamsin. "Get to the other side." She kicked her horse on, not daring to look back. Hollis and his men were halfway up the switchback, closing the distance. Harlan braced himself against the canyon wall. Above him, a section of the cliff was a treacherous, fractured overhang of loose rock and scree, balanced precariously. He put his shoulder to a large, key-shaped boulder that seemed to be holding the entire mass in place. He strained, his muscles bulging, his boots slipping on the gravel. The rock didn't budge. He heard Tamsin's horse clear the top of the rise. He heard Hollis's triumphant curse as he neared the ledge. Harlan took a breath, stepped back, and then slammed his entire body weight into the rock. It groaned. He did it again. A desperate, primal roar ripping from his chest. With a sound like a giant sigh, the keystone shifted. A pebble fell. Then another. Then, with a deafening crack, the entire overhang gave way. Tons of rock, sand, and shale peeled away from the cliff face and crashed down onto the switchback trail. It was a perfectly timed, perfectly aimed avalanche. It wasn't large enough to be lethal, but it was more than enough to be a barrier. It poured down, not on top of Hollis and his men, but directly in front of them, completely obliterating the trail they were on. Their horses screamed and reared, and the men were forced to scramble backward to avoid being swept away. When the dust settled, the path was gone. A steep, impassable slide of rock separated them from Harlan. Hollis, his face black with rage, raised his rifle and fired. The bullet sparked harmlessly off the rock. Yards to Harlan's left, he was out of range, and his path was blocked. Harlan didn't gloat. He simply swung back into Storm's saddle and rode to join Tamsin, who was waiting 50 yards on, her face as pale as chalk. They didn't look back. They rode on, the sound of Hollis's futile, enraged shouts fading behind them. They rode until the sun was low and the horses were trembling with exhaustion. The land had flattened into a high desert, dotted with piñon pine and juniper. They were safe from pursuit. But the day's ride, the chase, the sandstorm, had taken a terrible toll. Tamsin's hands were raw and bleeding, the rains having stripped the skin from her palms. Harlan found them shelter under a wide, shallow rock ledge that would protect them from the wind. He built a small, smokeless fire from dry juniper wood, its clean, sharp scent a comfort in the cold night, while he cooked their meager meal of dried beef. Tamsin sat staring into the flames, her hands throbbing in her lap. Harlan saw her wince. He went to his saddlebag, but instead of food, he pulled out his knife and walked to a nearby piñon pine. He made a small cut in the bark and gathered the sticky resinous sap that oozed out. He returned to the fire and knelt in front of her. "Give me your hands," he said. She hesitated, then extended them, palms up. They were a mess of raw, chafed skin. He said nothing. his face grim, with a touch as gentle as his hands were rough. He used his fingertips to spread the thick, medicinal pine resin over her wounds. It stung. But it was a clean, healing pain. The resin was a natural bandage, sealing the cuts from the dirt. "It's what my mother used," he said, his voice quiet, his eyes on his work. "Good for rope burns, or rain burns." He finished and wrapped her hands loosely in a clean strip of cloth from his bag. The simple, silent act of care, coming after the day's terror, broke the last of her defenses. This man, who could topple a cliff face, was tending to her with the gentleness of a nurse. She sat by the small fire, her bandaged hands in her lap, and she began to talk. She told him everything. Not the clipped, partial truth from the night before, but the whole, ugly story. "His name was Elias Thorne," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "A land baron in Colorado. He was charming. He hired me as his personal cartographer. Said he admired my precision, my mentor, a man named Mr. Abernathy. He practically begged me to take the job." She described how, for a year, the work was wonderful. She mapped new territories, her work praised for its accuracy. Then came the revisions. Small at first, just a minor adjustment to a property line, a shifting of a spring source by a few hundred yards. When she questioned it, Thorne had been paternal, reassuring. "A simple correction, my dear. The original survey was flawed." "But it wasn't flawed," she said, her voice thick with old shame. "Mine was. I was the one falsifying the data, and I was good at it. I made it look real. I helped him steal the water rights from an entire valley. I drew the maps that bankrupted 20 families." She told him about the night she found Thorne's private ledger, the one detailing the bribes to the land office, the payments to the judge. She told him how she had confronted him and how he had laughed, showing her the evidence he had manufactured, evidence that painted her as the sole architect of the fraud, a brilliant, ambitious woman who had fooled him all. "He gave me a choice," she said, a tear finally tracing a hot path through the dust on her cheek. "I could stay and take the blame, or I could run, so I ran. I took my original maps, and his letter instructing me to make the changes. I've been running ever since. I thought if I just kept moving, teaching in small towns, I thought he'd eventually stop looking for me." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I ran right into his same story. Harlan, I brought this plague here." Harlan listened. He did not interrupt. He did not judge. The firelight played across the hard planes of his face, his gray eyes fixed on hers. When she was finished, the silence of the high desert settled around them. He reached out, not to her hands, but to his saddlebag. He pulled out the jar of congealed pitch, the physical proof of Dameron's crime. He set it on the rock between them, where the firelight caught the ugly black-purple sheen of the poison. He looked from the jar to her. "Thorne's story, Dameron's story, it's the same old story of greed. Tamsin." He then reached out and gently, deliberately, placed his calloused hand over her bandaged ones. "You didn't bring this plague here," he said, his voice a low, solid, unshakable foundation. "You brought the cure. So, at dawn, we ride, and tomorrow, we fix this whole valley." At first light, they were mounted. They were stiff, sore, and bone-weary, but a new, shared resolve hardened their faces. They rode down from the high desert into the lowlands, and by mid-morning, they reached the final obstacle, Bitter Willow Creek. It was no longer a creek. The rain from the storm, combined with the liberated flow from the sabotaged valve, had turned it into a raging, muddy torrent. It was 50 yards across, a powerful, churning artery of brown water filled with debris, snags, and floating branches. There was no bridge for miles, and they had no time to find one. "We have to swim it," Harlan said, his face set. "It's the only way." Tamsin looked at the angry water, her heart seizing. The horses. They can make it, but we have to go now, before it rises further. He rode Storm to the edge. Give me your valise. She passed him the heavy bag, which he secured firmly to his own saddle horn. When we go in, get your feet out of the stirrups. If the horse goes down, you kick free. You understand? She nodded, her mouth dry. Stay right on my flank. Don't fight him. Let him have his head. Just guide him. Harlan spurred Storm, and the great black horse plunged into the churning water. Tamsin took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and kicked her mare forward. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath. The horses were instantly off their feet, swimming, their powerful legs churning, their heads held high, nostrils wide with effort and fear. The current was a living, malicious thing. It grabbed them, trying to spin them, to pull them downstream, to drag them under. Tamsin's mare panicked. It tried to turn back. Whinnying in terror, the current caught it broadside, and it began to founder. Tamsin! Harlan's voice cut through the roar. He had Storm under control, and he was already turning back for her. Before he could reach her, a large, dark shape, a log surfaced directly in front of her mare. The horse reared in the water, and Tamsin was thrown. She went under, the frigid, silty water closing over her head. She kicked free of the saddle, just as Harlan had said, and fought her way to the surface, gasping, her heavy clothes dragging her down. Her horse, now free of her weight, scrambled to regain its footing and swam desperately for the far bank. "Harlan!" she cried, flailing, the current pulling her away. He was there. He grabbed the front of her coat, his grip like a steel trap, and hauled her bodily across Storm's saddle, seating her behind him. "Hold on!" he yelled. She wrapped her arms around his waist, clinging to him, her face pressed against the solid, reassuring warmth of his back. She closed her eyes, her heart hammering against his spine. She felt the incredible power of Storm moving beneath them, the horse fighting the river, every muscle straining. She felt Harlan's body, a solid, immovable anchor in the chaos, and she held on, trusting him with her life. They burst from the water on the far bank, Storm scrambling up the muddy incline, water streaming from them in torrents. Tamsin was shaking so hard she could barely breathe, but they were alive. They were across. Her mare was 20 yards downstream, trembling but safe. They didn't rest. They were soaked, freezing. But Sagebrush Ferry was just ahead. They retrieved the mare, secured the valise, and rode, dripping, into the town's main street. The town was larger than Juniper Bluff, with a 2-story hotel and a proper brick courthouse. As they rode toward it, the bell in the courthouse tower began to toll, a deep, resonant clang that sounded the 9 o'clock hour. The court was in session. Time, after chasing them, was now about to run out. They dismounted at the hitching post, their clothes still dripping, leaving muddy puddles on the boardwalk. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck, raw, exhausted, but unbroken. And there, standing on the wide, white steps of the courthouse, as if he had been expecting them, was a man. He was tall, thin, and wore an immaculate black frock coat and a starched white shirt. He held a polished leather briefcase in one hand and smiled at them, a thin reptilian smile that held no warmth at all. Flanking him, looking smug and clean, were 2 of Dameron's paid men. The lawyer checked a gold watch on his vest. "Harlan Roan, and Miss Pike, I presume," he said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. "You're late, but, I'm afraid, also just in time for the proceedings." The lawyer's name was Fletcher, and he moved with the predatory grace of a coyote. He ignored their soaked, mud-stained clothes, his smile a thin, dismissive line. "Judge Armitage is currently hearing a petition," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "Filed by my client, Mr. Dameron, a petition to make the emergency closure of the Bitter Willow headwaters permanent, due to a geological event. It seems you've arrived just in time to witness the orderly process of the law." He turned and glided through the heavy oak doors, leaving them on the steps, The threat was clear. We have already won. You are a footnote to a story already written. Harlan looked at Tamsin, his face a granite mask of exhaustion and fury. She met his gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. They had not come this far to be turned away by a condescending suit. They pushed through the doors, Tamsin carrying the valise, Harlan carrying the cold weight of the coming confrontation. The courtroom was exactly as the world outside was not hot, airless, and suffocating. It was packed to the rafters, every bench filled with the grim, sun-scorched faces of farmers and ranchers from across the valley. The air was thick with the scent of cheap tobacco, sweat, and a desperate, collective anxiety. The crowd parted for them as they walked down the central aisle, a silent, rustling wave of worn denim and calico. They were a spectacle, the drenched, mud-spattered survivors of a journey everyone in the room knew was a fool's errand. At the front, on a raised dais, sat Judge Armitage. He was a man who looked as old as the mountains, his face a roadmap of deep-set wrinkles, a shock of white hair crowning his head, but his eyes, behind a pair of small, steel-rimmed spectacles, were sharp and clear, missing nothing. He looked up as they approached, his expression one of weary patience. He was known to be a man of the law, but whether his law was as pliable as Silas Dameron's money was the unspoken question hanging in the stifling air. Fletcher was already speaking, his voice resonating with a practiced, theatrical confidence. He stood before a large, beautifully rendered map, pinned to an easel. It was a clean, professional document, its lines crisp, its lettering perfect. And as this geological survey, commissioned by my client and conducted by the esteemed firm of Blackwood Sons, clearly indicates, Fletcher announced, tapping the map with a polished wooden pointer. The recent and unfortunate seismic tremor, the very same one that caused the rockslide on Red Butte Ridge, has resulted in a significant, and we fear permanent, subterranean shift. The aquifer that feeds Bitter Willow Creek has been tragically diverted. My client, Mr. Dameron, in an act of civic responsibility, has been forced to dam his own private reservoir to conserve what little water remains. A low, angry murmur rippled through the courtroom. The lie was so vast, so audacious. It was almost impressive. He was blaming the rockslide Harlan himself had caused on an act of God, and using it as the foundation for his fraudulent claim. The reduced flow to the lower valley is not a matter of malice, Fletcher continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. It is a natural disaster. A tragedy, to be sure, but one for which my client bears no responsibility. He turned, his thin smile encompassing the entire room, a wolf offering condolences to a flock of sheep. Judge Armitage looked from the map to Harlan and Tamsin. Mr. Roan, you have arrived in a rather dramatic fashion. Do you have a response to this petition? Harlan stepped forward, his wet boots leaving dark prints on the dusty floorboards. I do, Your Honor. This isn't a natural disaster. It's theft, Fletcher scoffed. An incendiary accusation, Your Honor, but one without a shred of proof. Where is your survey? Where is your evidence? It was Tamsin who answered. She stepped forward, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the thick atmosphere. We have evidence, Your Honor, but it is not on a map designed to deceive. It is in the land itself. She looked directly at the judge. If the court would permit it, I require a blackboard and chalk. A wave of confusion swept the room. Fletcher laughed out loud. Your Honor, this is a courtroom, not a one-room schoolhouse. Is the teacher planning to give us a lesson in penmanship? Judge Armitage ignored him, his sharp eyes fixed on Tamsin. He saw something in her gaze, not the hysteria of a desperate woman, but the cool, unwavering confidence of an expert. He nodded to the bailiff. Get the woman a blackboard. A dusty blackboard was dragged from a back room, its surface gray and streaked. The bailiff handed Tamsin a single, fresh piece of chalk. The courtroom fell utterly silent. The only sound was the faint scratching of the chalk as Tamsin began to draw. Her hands did not shake. Her lines were not the hesitant sketches of an amateur. They were the swift, certain strokes of a master craftsman. She was not just drawing, she was excavating. First, she drew the surface, the gentle slope of the land from the high ravine down toward Roan Hollow. Then, she drew what lay beneath. "This is a geological cross-section of the Bitter Willow headwaters," she began, her voice calm and authoritative, every person in the room leaning forward to hear. She drew a thick, solid line. "This is the bedrock, sandstone, formed over millennia. It is stable." Above it, she drew layers of shale and alluvial deposits. "These are the upper strata. They are permeable, allowing for the natural absorption and release of groundwater." Her chalk flew across the board, drawing the water table, the way the underground aquifers fed the creek. Her drawing was a living thing, a dissection of the valley's very bones and blood. Then, she drew the creek itself, and at the exact point of the headwaters, she drew a sharp, unnatural intrusion, a hard, geometric shape that cut through the soft, natural layers of earth and rock. "As Mr. Fletcher's map correctly indicates," she said, without a trace of sarcasm, "the land is composed of layers, strata. These layers are formed by pressure and time. They do not contain perfect, right-angled intrusions of cast steel." She drew the diversion valve, its shape stark and alien against the natural contours of her diagram. Water flows along the path of least resistance. It follows the contours of the land. It does not, Your Honor, spontaneously decide to flow uphill through a 2-foot iron pipe. She tapped the blackboard with her chalk, the sound a sharp crack in the silent room. A natural diversion would show evidence of faulting, of fractured bedrock, of upheaved strata. There is none of that here. There is only a neat, man-made excavation, a concrete foundation, and a piece of industrial hardware. This is not geology, Your Honor. This is plumbing. The farmer stared, mesmerized. She had taken a complex, invisible crime and made it plain as day. A brutal wound sliced into the earth. Fletcher's face was a mask of fury. This is speculation, a child's drawing. Where is the proof of this phantom hardware?" Harlan stepped forward. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in cloth. He walked to the judge's dais and placed it on the bench with a solid, definitive thunk that echoed through the room. He unwrapped it. It was the steel locking pin he had pulled from the valve. It was thick, greasy, and undeniably man-made, and stamped clearly into its head were a D and a C. Intertwined, Deco, Dameron Company. Judge Armitage picked it up. Turning it over in his hands, a new wave of murmurs swept the crowd. It was then that Dameron's side made its fatal mistake. Sitting behind Fletcher was a young, nervous-looking man with ink stains on his fingers. He had been looking back and forth between Tamsin's diagram and the pin in the judge's hand, his face growing paler by the second. Without thinking, he leaned forward and whispered urgently to Fletcher, the words carrying in the tense silence. "That's the pin from the prototype valve. They were never supposed to install that one." The courtroom erupted. Fletcher spun around and shot the young engineer a look of pure venom, but it was too late. The admission, the panicked, accidental confession, had been heard by everyone. Judge Armitage banged his gavel, his face like thunder. Silence, silence in this court. When the room had settled, he looked down at the pin, then at Tamsin. "You have made your point, Miss Pike, very effectively. There is more, Your Honor," Tamsin said, her voice ringing with a new strength. She turned and looked toward the back of the courtroom, where Ivy had been sitting, a small, terrified mouse, between Mrs. Whitlock and Mrs. Moreno. Tamsin met her eyes and gave her a small, encouraging nod. "I would like to call Miss Ivy Roan to make a statement." Fletcher was on his feet. "Objection. The girl is a known invalid. She is not a competent witness." "She is not here to offer testimony," Tamsin countered. "She is here to read a formal petition into the record." "Overruled, Mr. Fletcher," the judge growled. "Let the girl approach." A path cleared. Ivy, her face the color of chalk, began the long walk to the front of the courtroom. Her hands were shaking, and her steps were small and hesitant, but she did not falter. She clutched a single piece of paper in her hand. When she reached the witness stand, she did not look at the judge, or at Fletcher, or at the crowd. She looked at her brother. Harlan gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Ivy took a deep, shuddering breath, filling her lungs from the very bottom. Just as Tamsin had taught her, she unfolded the paper. "To the Honorable Court of Sagebrush Ferry," she began. Her voice was quiet, but it was as clear and steady as a church bell. The stammer, the choke, the hesitation, it was gone, banished by the sheer force of her will. "We, the undersigned landowners of the Bitter Willow Valley, do hereby formally petition this court for a full and independent inspection of the headwaters of the creek, to be conducted by a federally appointed territorial marshal. We allege that an illegal diversion of public water has occurred, and we demand that all private reservoirs connected to said headwaters be immediately investigated," she finished, her voice gaining strength with every word. She carefully folded the paper and placed it on the witness stand. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, a profound, stunned tribute to the girl's courage. Tamsin let the moment hang in the air. Then she played her final card. She walked to the valise, retrieved the anonymous confession, and handed it to the judge. "Your Honor, this is a statement from a man who claims he was forced to help install the illegal valve. We do not know his name, but we believe his handwriting may be familiar to the Dameron Company." Judge Armitage read the letter, his expression growing grimmer by the second. He looked up at Fletcher. "Mr. Fletcher, I am hereby ordering you to turn over your client's employment ledgers and payroll records for the past year. This court will conduct a full comparison of the handwriting." The legal battle was over, the net had been drawn tight, and that is when the law failed, and violence took its place. From the back of the courtroom, a figure rose. It was Cade Hollis, his face a twisted mask of rage and humiliation. He had not fled. He had stayed to watch his power crumble. In one swift, desperate motion, he drew his Colt peacemaker. "This court is over," he bellowed, his voice cracking with fury. People screamed. Farmers dove for cover. The bailiff fumbled for his own weapon. Hollis never had a chance to aim. Harlan moved in a blur. He was not a man anymore. He was a predator. He crossed the 10 feet that separated them in 2 long strides. He didn't go for the gun. He went for the man. He slammed into Hollis with the force of a charging bull, one hand grabbing the foreman's wrist, the other clamping down on the gun's cylinder to keep it from firing. There was a brief, brutal struggle. Harlan twisted Hollis's wrist with a sickening crunch of bone. The gun clattered to the floor. Harlan slammed Hollis's hand, the one he had just broken, down onto the edge of a wooden bench, pinning him there with all his weight. Hollis screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. The sheriff and his deputy were on them a second later, dragging Hollis, whimpering, into custody. The chaos subsided as quickly as it had erupted. Harlan stood, breathing heavily, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. Judge Armitage, who had not even flinched, banged his gavel, the sound like a series of gunshots. "Order, order," he roared. He pointed the gavel, not at Hollis, but at Fletcher. "This court is not over, sir. It has just begun." He stood, his full height seeming to fill the room with an ancient, implacable authority. "Based on the evidence and testimony presented here today, and the clear and present attempt to subvert the law through violence, I am issuing an immediate injunction." His voice boomed. "The Dameron Reservoir is to be sealed, effective immediately. The sheriff will post guards. I am ordering the main diversion valve, wherever and whatever it may be, to be opened to its full, natural capacity. The public ditches will have their water back until a full federal investigation is complete." A sound went through the room, a single, collective exhalation of breath that had been held for months, or perhaps years. It was the sound of hope, fragile but real. "This court is adjourned," the judge declared, banging the gavel one last time. Silas Dameron had not been in the room. His lawyer was defeated. His foreman was arrested. His scheme was exposed. But as the farmers and ranchers began to celebrate, to clap Harlan on the back, and to look at Tamsin with something approaching awe, a cold understanding remained. Dameron was not a man who accepted defeat. The head of the snake was still out there, unseen, and its fangs were still sharp. The threat had not passed. It had just been given a name and a face. The victory in the courtroom was a fragile thing, a temporary truce in a war that was far from over. The town of Sagebrush Ferry, however, desperate for a reason to celebrate, embraced it with a fervent, almost hysterical joy. As evening fell, the saloon's tinny piano could be heard from 2 streets away, and lanterns were strung between the awnings of the general store and the hotel, casting a festive, golden glow on the muddy streets. Harlan and Tamsin, provided with dry borrowed clothes and a hot meal at the sheriff's insistence, watched the celebration from the quiet shadows of the hotel porch. They were heroes, but they did not feel triumphant. They felt like soldiers between battles, the adrenaline of the fight replaced by a bone-deep weariness and the cold. Certain knowledge that the enemy was regrouping. Silas Dameron was not a man to be defeated by a piece of paper and a girl's testimony. He was a snake whose head was still very much attached. "It's too quiet," Harlan murmured, his gaze sweeping the darkened outskirts of the town, beyond the cheerful lantern light. "He's not the kind of man to just accept this." "He's not accepting," Tamsin agreed, pulling a borrowed shawl tighter around her shoulders. "He's reacting. We won't see it coming until it's already here." Her words were more prophetic than she knew. It began not with a bang, but with a color, a flicker of unnatural orange against the deep purple of the night sky, down by the ferry landing. A single, frantic shout cut through the celebratory noise, then another. The piano music faltered, then stopped. A bell began to clang, not the steady toll of the courthouse, but the frantic, panicked ringing of the fire alarm. The celebration turned instantly to a stampede. People poured out of the saloon and into the street, their faces, moments before flushed with drink and relief, now pale with a new, more primal fear. The orange flicker had become a hungry, roaring glow that painted the undersides of the clouds in terrifying hues. "What is it?" someone shouted. A man came running from the direction of the landing, his face smeared with soot. "It's the Deco warehouse, the one by the river. It's gone up." Harlan and Tamsin exchanged a single, grim look. The pitch warehouse, the one that surely held not only Dameron's supply of the toxic sealant, but also the purchase orders, the shipping manifests, the ledgers, all the physical proof that would corroborate the anonymous confession. This was not an accident. This was the deliberate, fiery destruction of evidence. They ran, pushing through the panicked, disorganized crowd. When they reached the end of the main street, the heat hit them like a physical blow. The warehouse, a large wooden structure, was already a lost cause. A monstrous bonfire roaring against the night sky. A column of thick, greasy black smoke boiled into the air, carrying with it a shower of incandescent embers. The smell was vile, a choking combination of burning wood and melting tar. But the fire itself was not the greatest danger. A strong south wind had picked up, a hot, dry gale that was fanning the flames with a blacksmith's bellows. It was pushing the fire, not out toward the open river, but north, directly toward the heart of Sagebrush Ferry, directly toward the ferry landing, where the steam ferry was docked, its boiler full, toward the stables, filled with dry hay, toward the freight office, which stored, as Tamsin knew from the town's manifests, barrels of kerosene and crates of blasting powder for the new railroad spur. The warehouse fire was a tragedy. The wind was turning it into a potential apocalypse. If a single one of those embers landed in the freight office, the entire riverfront would be blown to smithereens. Panic had seized the town. Men were forming a disorganized bucket brigade from the river. But the heat was so intense they couldn't get close. The buckets of water they threw hissed into steam a dozen feet from the flames, a useless, pathetic gesture against the inferno. In the midst of the chaos, Tamsin's mind became a place of cold, clear logic, fire, fuel, oxygen. The wind was the oxygen, the town was the fuel. She could not stop the wind. She had to fight the fire. With what? The river was too far. The effort too slow. They needed volume. They needed pressure. And then, her mind made the leap. The court order. The Dameron Reservoir. The judge's words echoed in her memory. Sealed, effective immediately. But she had seen it on the maps. Every reservoir, by territorial law, had to have an emergency release valve, a scour gate at the base of the dam for flushing out silt. It was a safety measure. It was their only hope. The reservoir was high on the ridge above the town. The pressure would be immense. She grabbed the arm of the town sheriff, a harried man named Miller. "Sheriff Dameron's reservoir. Where is the emergency gate?" Miller stared at her, his face blank with confusion. "It's sealed by the court. We can't. We are about to lose the town." Tamsin's voice cut through his panic like a whip. "The fire will hit the freight office in 10 minutes. We can use his own water to fight his own fire. Where is the gate?" A flicker of understanding lit his eyes. "On the north side of the dam, but it takes a huge wrench. It's a 2-man job." "Then get me 6 men," Tamsin commanded. She turned and saw Old Man Whitlock and the Moreno brothers, their faces grim. "You with me now." They didn't hesitate. They followed her, running, away from the fire, toward the high, dark ridge that loomed over the town. As Tamsin organized her waterborne assault, Harlan initiated his own. The bucket brigade was failing. They needed to get water on the fire, not just near it. He looked at the frantic, useless efforts and then at the large, canvas tarpaulins covering the goods on the ferry dock. An idea, desperate and brutal, took shape. He let out a sharp whistle. Storm, who had been tethered safely a street away, answered his call. Harlan vaulted into the saddle. "Get me every tarp you can find," he roared to a group of stunned men. "And rope, and your wives' thickest sewing needles." He rode Storm like a dark thunderbolt, his purpose clear. He directed the men to lay the heavy, oilcloth tarps end to end. As they worked, he used his own knife to cut them into long, wide strips. They were creating a hose, a monstrous, makeshift canvas artery. Women arrived, their faces pale, their sewing kits in hand, and began the frantic work of stitching the seams together while men reinforced them with rope. Meanwhile, back at the fire, Ivy Roan had found her own role. The bucket brigade was a mess of shouting, colliding men. Ivy, standing on a stack of crates where she could see everything, pulled a small silver whistle from her pocket. She put it to her lips and blew a single, piercingly sharp note. The sound cut through the roar of the fire. The men stopped, turning to look at her. She blew again. 2 short blasts. The men closest to the river looked at each other. 2 short blasts. Fill buckets. She pointed at them. Then, she pointed at a second group of men and blew a long, sustained note. Pass buckets. Finally, she pointed at the men nearest the flames and blew a series of 3 sharp, staccato notes. Throw water. A rhythm was born from the chaos. Short, short, long, short, 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 fill, pass, throw. Ivy was no longer a frightened girl. She was a field commander, her silver whistle a baton, conducting a desperate symphony of survival, her clear, precise signals bringing a fragile order to the edge of the inferno, high above the town. Tamsin and her crew reached the Dameron Dam. 2 of the sheriff's deputies stood guard, their rifles at the ready. "Judge's orders," one of them shouted. "No one touches this dam." "The town is burning," Tamsin yelled back, not breaking stride. "Help us, or get out of the way." They found the emergency gate, its massive iron wheel rusted from disuse. It took all 6 of them, with a 10-foot steel bar as a lever, to break the seal. With a groan of protesting metal that seemed to shake the mountain, the wheel began to turn, and from a wide culvert at the base of the dam, a trickle of water became a torrent. Then a roaring, explosive flood, a river, Damron's stolen river, was unleashed down the steep, rocky spillway that led toward the back of the town. At the same moment, Harlan's desperate creation was complete. They had 100-foot length of stitched-together canvas. It was ugly, leaky, but it might just work. He tied one end securely to the town's main water pump, the one used for filling the horse troughs. He looped the other end over his saddle horn. "Get ready to pump," he yelled. "Pump like your lives depend on it." He spurred Storm forward, dragging the heavy, unwieldy canvas hose toward the fire. The water Tamsin had released hit the back of the town in a roaring wave, flooding the alleys and streets, creating a wide, uncrossable moat of water between the burning warehouse and the ferry landing. It was a desperate firebreak, a barrier of Damron's own making. Harlan reached the edge of the heat, the air scorching his lungs. "Now," he roared. Behind him, 4 men threw their weight onto the long iron handle of the town pump. The pump groaned, then caught. Water surged into the canvas hose. It stiffened, swelled, and began to leak from 100 frantic seams, but it held. A powerful jet of water erupted from the end Harlan controlled. He braced himself in the saddle, directing the spray not at the main fire, but at the roof of the freight office, soaking the dry shingles, quenching the falling embers, protecting the explosives within. They were holding it. The fire was contained on one side by Tamsin's river, and on the other by Harlan's hose. The town was going to survive. It was then, through the smoke and the steam, that they saw him, a figure, silhouetted against the flames on the collapsing roof of the warehouse. He was trapped, a small island in a sea of fire. He waved his arms, his shouts lost in the roar. It was Cade Hollis. He had either been released or had escaped, and had likely been the one to set the fire, only to be caught in his own trap. "Leave him," someone shouted from the crowd. "Let the devil burn." Harlan looked at the desperate, terrified figure, then at the smoldering roof of the freight office. He could not be in 2 places at once. To save Hollis was to risk the town. He made his choice. He dropped the hose, shouting for other men to take it. He wheeled Storm around, soaking his own scarf from a puddle, and tied it over the horse's eyes. "Hollis!" he roared. "Jump!" The roof groaned. Sagging visibly, Hollis was paralyzed with fear. "I can't. My leg's broken." Harlan didn't hesitate. He spurred the blindfolded Storm forward, charging into the inferno. The heat was a physical hammer blow. He galloped the horse alongside the burning building, right beneath the eaves. He stood in his stirrups, his face a mask of raw determination. "Now, Hollis, it's now or never." He reached up, grabbing the foreman's arm. With a surge of pure, desperate strength, he hauled the larger man from the roof and dragged him, half-conscious, across the front of his saddle. He turned Storm and galloped back out of the furnace just as the roof collapsed inward in a volcanic eruption of sparks and flame. He dumped Hollis, coughing and whimpering, onto the wet ground at the sheriff's feet. "Why," the foreman gasped, clutching his shattered leg, "why'd you do it?" Harlan looked down at the man who had tried to ruin him, who had threatened his sister, who had tried to burn down the town. "Because justice doesn't need a body count," he said, his voice rough with smoke and exhaustion. Sheriff Miller knelt beside the whimpering foreman. "Was it Damron? Cade, did Damron order you to set this fire?" Hollis, his face pale with pain and terror, looked from the smoldering ruins to Harlan's grim face, and something in him broke. "Yes," he sobbed. "He ordered it. He told me to burn everything, burn the evidence, burn the whole damn town if I had to." The sheriff stood up, his face set like stone. He looked at his deputy. "You heard him? That's a full confession. You go right now and you wire the territorial marshal. Tell him we have a warrant for the arrest of Silas Dameron, for arson, for conspiracy, and for attempted murder." Slowly, the fire died. The combination of water and the warehouse consuming its own fuel left only a steaming, hissing skeleton of charred timbers. The crisis was over. The entire riverfront was a lake, the moon. now high in the sky, cast its serene, silver light over the scene of devastation, its reflection shimmering on the vast pools of water as if scattering a fortune in silver coins. In the middle of the street, surrounded by the exhausted, soot-stained, and soaking wet citizens of Sagebrush Ferry, Harlan stood, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond muscle and bone. Tamsin walked toward him through the mud and the ash. She didn't speak. She walked directly into his arms, wrapping her own around him, pressing her face against his chest. He held her, his arms a circle of solid, unshakable strength. His head rested on hers, and in the quiet aftermath of the storm of fire and water, she could feel his heart hammering against her cheek. It was a frantic, powerful rhythm, the beat of a man who had faced death and walked away, and beneath it, she could hear her own, a mirror image of his. Their hearts were beating in perfect, exhausted unison, a rhythm that matched the slow, steady pulse of the town they had just saved. On the edge of the crowd, standing in the shadows, Old Man Whitlock took off his hat. He held it over his chest and nodded, a slow, deep gesture of profound respect. He was not looking at Harlan. He was looking at Tamsin, a few feet away. The Moreno brothers did the same. One by one, the other ranchers, the silent, stoic men of the valley, removed their hats. It was a quiet, unadorned, and deeply eloquent tribute. She was no longer a stranger. She was one of them. The dawn that followed the fire was not like any that had come before. The light itself seemed different, as if it had been scoured clean and newly polished overnight. It poured into the bitter Willow Valley, chasing away the last of the shadows, illuminating a world that had been pushed to the brink and had, by some miracle, held. The air was cold and sharp, smelling of wet ash, damp earth, and the distant, clean scent of pine from the high country. Down in the valley, the change was not just in the light, but in the sound. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the irrigation ditches were running full. The sound of Bitter Willow Creek, liberated and strong, was a constant, joyful murmur, a song of liberation that threaded through the fields and pastures. It was the sound of a promise kept, the sound of life returning. By mid-morning, the final act of the legal drama played out with a quiet, almost anticlimactic finality. Judge Armitage, his face set in grim satisfaction, signed the official court order. It formally dissolved Dameron's fraudulent claim, revoked his water rights, and established a new water management council, to be composed of 5 elected ranchers, Harlan Roan among them. A short time later, 2 territorial marshals, their faces impassive and their badges gleaming in the morning sun, escorted a shackled and disheveled Silas Dameron from the town jail. He was no longer the imperious land baron, the unseen puppet master. He was just a man, his expensive suit ruined, his eyes hollow with a venomous, impotent rage. He scanned the crowd of silent farmers who had gathered to watch, his gaze searching for Harlan and Tamsin. When he found them, he offered a look of pure, undiluted hatred, a silent promise of a vengeance that would never come. They watched, unmoved, as he was placed in a prison wagon and began the long, dusty journey to the federal penitentiary. The head of the snake had been severed. The town seemed to exhale a collective breath it had been holding for years. A quiet, almost reverent celebration began to unfold. It was not the boisterous, drunken affair of the previous evening, but something deeper, more meaningful. It was a celebration of survival. In the center of the town square, someone had placed a sturdy wooden crate, and upon this makeshift stage, Ivy Roan, at the gentle urging of Mrs. Whitlock, stepped up. The crowd fell silent, their faces turned toward the girl who had found her voice in the crucible of the courtroom. She stood for a moment, her hands clasped before her, a stark contrast to the trembling figure she had once been. She was no longer a fragile girl. She was the conscience of the valley. She took a deep, steadying breath, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her friends and neighbors. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried with a newfound resonance. clear and unwavering, to every corner of the square. "For a long time," she began, "we were afraid. We were made to feel that the water we needed to live was a gift, something that could be taken away. We were made to feel that it was a rope around our necks, to be tightened whenever we spoke out." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But we were wrong. Yesterday, we learned the truth. We learned that the law, when wielded with courage, is a shield, and we learned that our voices, when joined together, are a force of nature." She looked out at the distant green line of the creek. "Water is life," she declared, her voice ringing with a simple, profound truth. "It is not a noose." For a moment, there was a stunned silence. And then, the applause began. It was not polite clapping, it was a thunderous, cathartic roar, a wave of sound that erupted from the crowd, echoing off the storefronts and rolling up toward the high, silent ridges. Men in worn denim threw their hats into the air. Women wept openly, their faces shining with relief. It was the sound of a town reclaiming its soul. Harlan and Tamsin stood at the edge of the crowd, near their horses, which were saddled and ready. He watched his sister, a look of fierce, quiet pride on his face that was more eloquent than any words. As the applause finally began to subside, he turned to Tamsin. The din of the crowd seemed to fade away, leaving them in a small, quiet bubble of their own. "What about this morning?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. He did not say "your promise." He did not say "leaving." He simply asked the question that had been sitting, unspoken, between them since the fire. Tamsin's gaze drifted from his face, past the celebrating townspeople, to the long, dusty road that led out of Sagebrush Ferry. It was a road she knew well. It was the road that had been her constant companion, her only real home. It snaked away into the vast, open country, disappearing into a hazy, undefined horizon that promised anonymity, safety, and a profound, aching loneliness. It was the road of her past. Then, as if pulled by a magnetic force, her gaze was drawn back in the other direction, toward the distant, hazy shape of the Red Butte Ridge, and in her mind's eye, she did not see the treacherous trails or the sandstorm. She saw Roan Hollow. She saw the solid, welcoming shape of the stone and timber house. She saw the morning sun slanting across the porch. She saw the weathered swing where she had mended his coat, the tall willow trees whispering by the newly flowing creek, the warm kitchen with its smell of coffee and wood smoke. She saw the map on the table, no longer a weapon or a burden, but a testament, clean of chalk dust and fear. She saw a home. She turned back to Harlan, and the last of her old fears, the last of the running fugitive she had once been, simply dissolved in the clear, steady light of his gaze. "I will still leave," she said, her voice soft but imbued with a quiet, unshakable certainty. On mornings when there is a fraudulent map to be corrected in another valley, on mornings when a quiet voice needs to be taught how to speak the truth to a bully, on mornings when justice needs finding somewhere else. She took a small step closer, her hand finding his. "But today," she said, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face, "today, I'm staying." The relief that washed over his face was a thing of profound beauty. It was as if a great, heavy weight he had been carrying his entire life had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He did not crush her in a desperate embrace. He simply pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her with a sureness, a rightness, that felt as natural as breathing. It was not a rushed, fearful claiming. It was a quiet, confident homecoming, a solid, unbreakable circle of a man who knew, finally, where he belonged. He tilted her chin up, and his kiss was not like the first. The first had been a discovery, a question. This was an answer. It was deep and warm. A kiss of profound tenderness and absolute certainty, a silent vow of a shared future, of mornings spent together and battles fought side by side. As they stood there, wrapped in their own quiet world, The sounds of the valley seemed to rise up around them, the happy shouts of children, finally allowed to run barefoot and splash in the muddy puddles, the low, contented lowing of cattle in a distant pasture, and from the small, whitewashed church at the edge of town, the bell began to ring, not in alarm, but in a slow, steady, joyous peal that spoke of peace. It was a quiet, unremarkable peace, and it was therefore the most profound and precious thing in the world. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, they sat together on the porch of Roan Hollow. The world was quiet, the air was warm. Tamsin had her leather-bound notebook, her most trusted companion, open on her lap. She uncapped her small tin of ink, dipped her pen, and on a clean, fresh page, she wrote a new title, Map of the Bitter Willow Water Veins. She wrote, her script as clear and steady as Ivy's had been, and beneath it, she added a second line, drawn by the hands of two. Harlan, sitting beside her, leaned over. He did not read the words. He simply placed his large, calloused hand flat on the page, its shadow shielding the fresh ink from the glare of the afternoon sun. He held it there, protecting her work, protecting their story. And in the quiet, peaceful valley, surrounded by the gentle murmur of the flowing water, the heart of Juniper Bluff and of the two people who had saved it beat with the quiet, steady rhythm of a heart come home. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our journey together, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories, 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach even more listeners.